Okay. And so the idea here would be that the unemployment rate is changing relative to the steady state condition and the steady state value. So given a particular level of unemployment, your labor market will have a particular steady state. And when you do the math here, you find that the steady state is equal to the rate of job separation, so that people currently employed who are leaving their jobs, and then divided by the rate of job separation plus the rate of job finding. So you can see that the change in unemployment rate here is going to be the relative change in separation rate compared with separation rate plus the job finding rate. So of all of the movement occurring in your labor market, what proportion is it job separation? And that is going to equal the steady state for any given particular labor situation. So we can go through a fairly simple numerical example to kind of show how things would go to the steady state. The basic idea here is if we think about unemployment as a change variable, so to what extent did unemployment change from period T to period T plus one? That's going to be the change in unemployment in time period T plus one. That ends up equaling a fairly straightforward equation where you have L minus U, right? Labor force minus unemployment times T times job separation, right? So L minus U is the number of employed. So what of those are being separated from their jobs minus then the number of unemployed times the job finding rate, right? So this is just what is net job gain relative? I'm sorry, what is job gain relative to job loss, and therefore net job gain? And then if you just go through and you think about this in terms of a rate, then you get some pretty interesting dynamics. So if S over S plus F is greater than the unemployment rate, then the change in unemployment rate must be increasing, right? And then you get this sort of opposite effect. So the idea is that your economy is always moving to the steady state. The steady state is ultimately defined by the rate of job separation relative to the rate of all job. I'm sorry, the rate of job separation relative to all of the movement in the labor market, both separation as well as job finding. Now, one of the sort of main assumptions that we make in this particular model is that we're going to assume that F is less than one, that the rate of job finding is less than one, and we have some. Again, I mentioned that we're going to start talking more about these sort of rigidities. And to the extent that rigidities end up playing a really important role in the Keynesian sort of idea, there are rigidities in labor markets that arise from the fact that it takes a while, right? You may stay unemployed not because the economy's bad, but simply because you haven't found that job that it exists out there for you, but you haven't found it yet, right? So you're still unemployed, but the economy actually has a job for you. You just haven't found it yet, right? So that's one reason why the job finding rate tends to be less than one. And also wage rigidity. So wage rigidity is really interesting and becomes a really important conversation towards the tail end of this particular week. But the idea behind wage rigidity is that in a sort of completely efficient economic system, wages would automatically sort of restabilize. And so therefore, if I wanted to quit my job and there was a better job in a sense for me, a job that my marginal product would be higher for that company, that's what we mean by better, then my wage would be higher. Right. So I would seek a higher wage by quitting my current job and trying to find a new job. Though that higher wage may not exist for me yet, right? There may be wage rigidities which keep the sort of wages amongst different positions equal, therefore not creating the incentive for people to actually find that new job, for example. So that's a major source of wage rigidity. That ends up being a really interesting conversation we have about the extent to which firms change the wage offers that they make to their employees relative to other economic conditions. It works kind of as you would expect it to, but there are some interesting nuances there. And it certainly has some immense policy implications when you start talking about the duration of unemployment, right? So that's really what we end up being really interested in, is how long is unemployment? How long is it going to take? And then depending upon how long you have sort of a particular unemployment spell, what should be done about it, if anything? And again, remember, the focus here is going to be on that sort of cyclical unemployment that we have been talking about. And again, like I said, as sort of through all this, there's this sort of interesting conversation about sectoral shifts, right? This brings back sort of the Joseph Schumpeter idea of creative destruction, right? So one aspect of capitalism is that it is said to have creative destruction. So markets die to give rise to future markets, and that creates structural unemployment, right? The typewriter industry gives rise to the computer industry. That creates unemployment amongst people who are trained in typewriters. And until those people become trained in computers, they're not going to be able to work in the computer industry. That is not a bad thing in the broadest sort of sense of a macroeconomy. It's bad for those previously working in typewriter industry people. That it's bad for them. They experience economic misery, and we should care about that, by the way. That isn't something that we should just ignore. But in terms of the macroeconomy is fine. That process is actually probably good for it. This is where policy really starts to distort or even pervert this conversation, because what you have often is politicians who want to sort of work against the flow of the macroeconomy, and often argue that creative destruction is not a good thing, and it should be something that we should actively try to prevent. And economists really don't like that idea. It's funny because you would think that in coming from a tradition where you had this neoclassical classical model, which was basically hands off, don't do anything to the economy, that you would think the net result of that in the modern era, especially after the Keynesian revolution, was that we would become very much hands on. But the problem is that the economists don't trust or expect politicians to really know necessarily what are going to be those future markets. And in fact, there's plenty of examples in which governments get that wrong. And so industrial policy, as it is often referred to, I think I've mentioned this, is fraught with a lot of potential inefficiencies, and economists just don't really trust it very well. So even if let's say, I personally think, for example, that it makes a lot of sense for us to subsidize particular industries for particular reasons, I also have to acknowledge that the ability of the government to subsidize and then therefore promote, economic behavior is going to be probably much more imperfect than I want it to be, and that should give me pause as to what I demand in a sense from the government. All right, and then just to give you a real quick idea of like that effect of wage rigidity, just so you have again a graph in the back of your mind. So let's imagine for a moment that the supply of labor is a very sort of classical. There's a supply of labor relative to the amount of available people to work. And again, the idea, remember, there is that we're going to think about that supply of labor as being the natural rate of employment, or representing, in a sense, the natural rate of unemployment. And so what actually causes this unemployment from a wage rigidity perspective is that, in a sense, wages should fall to something like, let's call this W0. The wage should fall, in a sense, to cause equilibration in the labor market. But because of wage rigidity, you don't see that sort of particular fall. And so as a result, there's a persistent and a lack of market clearing. Okay, that's going to be a really, really important idea. Remember, classical neoclassical model argued very strongly that we have market clearing basically at all times. A key Keynesian argument is that, in part, due to things like wage rigidities, markets are not always going to clear. And because markets are not always going to clear, we don't get that sort of efficiency gain that we would typically expect to have. All right, so we'll talk more about this a little bit later. Um, Chronic unemployment has at times been the main kind of policy concern of the government as well as the Federal Reserve. We had chronic unemployment in the 70s and 80s. That is going to be a big part of the transition from, at the time, Keynesian economy to kind of post-Keynesian economics. So unemployment really starts to take over as the main sort of point of interest for obvious reasons, and certainly, when put into the context of the Great Depression, I think makes a lot of sense. And then this is just some graphical representation of unemployment data over time. So unemployment rate relative to gross domestic product. When the recessions, we see unemployment go up. So the idea here would be that if we look at, like, there's going to be this sort of natural rate of unemployment, let's say around 4.5%, right? And then any uptick in unemployment is going to be cyclical unemployment. So all these bits of unemployment here, notice they all occur after recessions, right? Every one of these blips in unemployment happen after recession. So that cyclical unemployment. Everything below that is that natural rate of unemployment. And you can see here's non-cyclical unemployment. You can see that in the US, we have a lot less non-cyclical unemployment than we used to. Again, it's one of those really good stories about the US economy that you don't typically hear. We have way less structural unemployment than we used to have in the US economy. Okay. So again, we're going to come back to this conversation about unemployment. We're going to have conversations about underemployment, sectoral shifts. That's coming in the wrong. But I want to just make sure that we had kind of the basics of what unemployment looks like, the three types of unemployment with a specific focus on cyclical unemployment. And then again, later on, issues like wage rigidities are going to loom really large. And also, again, we want to think in terms of flows. So that sort of argument that we want to think about the labor market in terms of a steady state coincides with the sort of flow model that we already have in terms of the neoclassical setting.